Just 8 players remain standing in the Feday World Cup, and they played game 1 of the 5th round today. Some of the players were quite conservative. Maybe the tension is getting to them. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Nishikiri drew fairly quickly, very solid game, as did Peter Svidler and Wei Yi, also quite a quick draw. The other 2 games were very interesting. We had Mamedyarov sacrificing exchange quite early on against Karyakin, got some great pressure, but Karyakin just about hung on and drew the game. That was very hard fought, very long game. And then there was this game, Pavel Eljanov against Hikaru Nakamura. And this is a real clash of styles, a clash of cultures. Eljanov from the Ukraine grew up in that very formal chess school of the Soviet Union. Great strategist, believes in sticking to the rules. Whereas Nakamura, well, he's capable of playing all kinds of chess, but he's prepared to break the rules and take risks when necessary. But you can see on the board it's a very standard Catalan. This was exactly the same variation as Giri and Leko played. You might recall I looked at that game a few days ago. And in this position, instead of Queen D1 that Giri played, Eljanov played Queen C1. Well, it's been seen before. It's just slightly different. So it means it's harder for Black to achieve the breaking move C5, because now the Queen is on C1. Nakamura played H6, and that's the approved move in this position. Eljanov took. Now he's given up 2 bishops, but it does mean that he gains greater control over C5, so it's harder for Black to break out with C5. So, you give something to get something. And now Rook D1 from Eljanov. Again, it has been seen before. So that's another point to playing Queen C1. It does make room for the Queen, for the Rook to support the D pawn, and again it makes it much harder for Black to break out with E5 and C5 when the Rook stands opposite the Queen. Standard stuff. A5, typical move for this kind of position. Black wants to gain control over the B4 square. Knight D2, and now, well, this was a typical Nakamura decision. In a previous game between Bareyev and Gelfand, Gelfand didn't mess around. He just exchanged off bishop for knight and played C6. So he's giving up the 2 bishops, but he's got a very solid structure. And after this, it's difficult for White to make progress. White is obviously better in this position. He's got a slight space advantage, but with control over B4, it doesn't look that serious. So that's the strategically approved way of playing from the Soviet school. But Nakamura, well, he likes to risk a bit more. And he kept his bishops. And it's a very interesting decision, because that bishop tucked away can be very useful on this diagonal. Knight B3. Knight looks good, coming to the outpost on C5. So C6. Now, if Black can achieve Knight A6 to B4 in combination with the bishop on H7, it looks like decent counterplay. And 2 bishops, well, it's an interesting, dynamically balanced position. So Queen C3, good move, preventing the knight coming to A6. Bishop E7, so that's looking at the B4 square, maybe bishop B4. Knight C5, so the knight's hitting the outpost. Queen C7, and Knight E5. So the knights look very impressive. So you can see that in keeping the 2 bishops, Black lost a bit of time. Now here it's possible to play Rook D8, but Nakamura played the most provocative move, Knight A6. That's a testing move. That's so typical of his style. Here, if White backs down, Black has very few difficulties here. Or, well, bishop E4 is also possible to exchange off the bishops, and then Knight B4. Again, Black with a knight on B4 should be okay. So to get anything from this position, White really has to plunge in, and Eljanov did that. He realised this is the correct way to play. But Nakamura gets what he wants here, which is an unbalanced position. And well, Black probably doesn't have much better than this. They reached an endgame where White has rook and 2 pawns against 2 bishops. White ought to be better here, but if it goes wrong, then the minor pieces can look very good. Let's see how Eljanov played it. Knight c6, good move, attacking bishop and pawn. So the bishop dropped back to protect the a5 pawn. Now at first I was thinking, well, the knight is pretty strong, so maybe something like f3 to play e4, but bishop g5 is quite an annoying move. Bishop looking good here in combination with this one. Of course, if f4, then it weakens the e4 square. So Eljanov, well, after a 13-minute thought, snapped off the bishop, and it's a principled move. You should take off that bishop. And now f3. Good move. Making room for the king and perhaps potentially locking out that bishop. And for the moment, that knight not looking so great, but Black fights back. Rook c8. Now here, I'd anticipated something like rook c1, maybe f6 to free the king and bring the bishop out, then maybe e4, bishop comes here, and I don't know, I was looking at perhaps moving the king in, maybe rolling the pawns down the board. Problem with this is whenever the pawns advance, then the knight comes to b4. And, well, we saw a situation yesterday where Wojciech had two pawns, C and D pawns, and they got blockaded very easily by the bishop and knight. Black has counterplay there. It's not easy to roll the pawns down the board. They can get blockaded. Eljanov played rook a3, and I have to say that move really surprised me. Splitting the rooks, don't like splitting the rooks. But there is method in his madness. Just watch what happens. King f2. Again, I was maybe thinking perhaps e4, but okay. White plays it very steadily. Rook b8. So Nakamura starts to try to get some counterplay with the rook. Of course, if e4, then the rook can hassle the king. So rook d2. Good move. And f6, so perhaps the bishop can just duck down to e8 and look at the a pawn. And now I was thinking, well, the time is right to play e4 and then bring the king in the middle. But, the king comes over, not easy to advance those central pawns. It's kind of a balanced position, maybe the rook can get active. But after Eljanov played his rook back, I started to realise, okay, this guy really knows what he's doing. This is very clever. Basically, he's not pushing the e-pawn unless it's really powerful, and that keeps his king absolutely secure. The most important thing is actually not to push those pawns, but to activate the rooks. Eljanov had this spot on. Rook b3. Now, instead of pushing that pawn, allowing Black's pieces in, Eljanov just gave up that pawn in order to activate the rooks. Of course, White desperately wants to trade rooks, and then the rook would come in and snap the pawn very easy. Rook c3, rook b5. So the rook is activated, and White manages to snap that pawn off. Again, Eljanov taking no risks with his king is completely secure. And that, in practical terms, makes it much easier for White to play. He doesn't have to worry about his king. He can just get on with activating his rooks and pushing that a-pawn. Now, it's difficult for Nakamura here, because if he brings his king up the board towards the centre, then it's going to be cut to shreds with these pins. Could be that even d5 straight away there is strong. So he tucked his king away in the corner, but the problem is now, I mean, I think he probably had to do that. You know, there are weak pawns here, and you know the king cannot help with the defence. And Eljanov plays this so precisely, just really beautifully. So this rook has to look after the bishop and knight, so they don't have really strong support. You know, they need a pawn to support these pieces, but it's a tough job. And the pawn advances, bishop c6 and a7. The pawn is going all the way. And now bishop d5. Of course, white would love to play rook b8 here, but then rook a4 actually wins that pawn. So Eljanov played rook a2, giving up the pawn on d4, but it means he's able to activate his rooks now. So rook c2, the knight had to blockade on a8, and now rook a6. Again, if the rook goes to b8, then rook a4 is a problem. So rook a6, just holding everything for the moment. Once again, black's problem is that there's no real counterplay. White is completely solid on the king side, and that gives his rooks the freedom to roam around the board, to hassle black's position. Well, hassle the knight, hassle the bishop, hassle the pawn, and ultimately to turn towards black's king. That's the real prize here, if you can't push the a-pawn home. So Eljanov starts the squeeze on the king side. You know, one would really like to play h5 in this position, and that will get the king in a mating net, then the rook's to the 8th rank. So, well, h5 was played here, but there are obvious drawbacks to that move. It potentially allows the king in, and this is what happened. Here I was anticipating king g6. Now, ultimately, I think this is probably losing. You know, there can be some very nasty pins in the position, but I think that's Nakamura's best chance. And sometimes e4 happens as well. So yeah, I'm sure it's losing, but I think it's the best chance. What happened in the game was, well, just beautifully played by Eljanov, I have to say. So now the rook activates. Threat to take here and take here. Rook a1. Well, white could actually simplify here, and that might be winning, but it's much better to move the king in. This removes any doubt. So Eljanov gives up the a-pawn, but manages to break through. Threat of mate on h8, g6, and the finish of the game is just brutal. Nakamura has no defense at all. All these pawns are dropping. Added to that, there are mating threats. And once again, because Eljanov did not advance the e-pawn, then he's completely solid. So that bishop actually is just biting on rock here. Black has zero counterplay. So let's just see how the game concluded. I'm sure there are many ways to win this position, but what Eljanov did was really simple. Removed that pawn and prepares to advance the h-pawn. And around about here, Nakamura resigned. It really is hopeless. So the rook can't move because the knight is on. If the knight moves, then let's give a check. And if the king goes in the corner, well, there are many ways to win this, but I rather like king h6 followed by rook h7 mate, and if king f8, then many ways to win, but that's not bad. Keep it simple. Let's take a piece. Brilliant victory by Pavel Eljanov, so he goes one up. Let's not write off Nakamura yet. He's got the white pieces tomorrow, and we know what an incredible fighter he is. But Eljanov having an absolutely blistering tournament, and what beautiful technique he showed there.